Okay, hello everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us for this Green Recovery Festival session, which is a spotlight talk with James Thornton. It's great to have James with us here today, and in his talk he'll be sharing some insights into what it will take to align policy and practical goals in order to achieve a green recovery that truly changes the social and economic systems that are damaging the climate. For those who aren't too familiar with the crowd, we are a network for business leaders to explore and exchange ideas on corporate sustainability and responsible business issues. We're hosting this Green Recovery Festival, a fortnight of talks, panels, interactive sessions around how the COVID-19 recovery can be aligned with the transition to a low carbon future. In terms of format for this session, after a presentation from James, we'll open up to a Q&A. Please ask questions via the Q&A function. Don't forget to say who you are and your organisational affiliation, if you have one. We are also streaming on YouTube and social media today. So if you want to ask a question through one of those channels, please use the hashtag #TheCrowd and hashtag James Thornton, and the crowd team will feed those questions into Zoom here. I just want to thank our sponsors, the Charities Aid Foundation, ADNAMS and the RIBA. Without our sponsors, the crowd couldn't host these events, so thank you very much. If you're interested to find out more about sponsorship of the crowd events and our COP26 activities coming up next year, please do get in touch with myself or a colleague. Okay, so now to introduce our spotlight speaker. James Thornton is founding CEO of Client Earth. James launched Client Earth in 2007, sparking fundamental change in the way environmental protections are made and enforced across Europe. The New Statesman has named James as one of 10 people who could change the world. And in 2016, he was named as one of the 1,000 most influential people in London. So we're in good hands today. And yeah, thanks for being here, James. Over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany, and I'm pleased to be with all of you today. It's a pleasure in lockdown times to reach out and make a lot of friends electronically. So that's what we're doing today. So I appreciated the invitation to come and talk to you about COVID recovery and how it could align with green ambitions. And there are a variety of ways in which we can approach this. What I'd like to do is to start with a little bit of economics, and then move on to an overview of the green recovery plans and programs of the EU, of the UK, and then also what China is doing. And I think that will give us, and perhaps very briefly to the US if you want to get into questions about that. And I think that will give us an interesting overview for discussion on what the policy and fiscal intentions are of these very important countries and groups of countries. So first, an economic study. Our friends at the Oxford Smith School in May published an important study on COVID recovery. So there had already been one set of economic stimuli, but the second and third waves of that stimulus were still to be seen, and indeed are still being discussed, debated, and implemented. And what these economists wanted to know was, what are the characteristics of the best green recovery? What would it look like if we could just design the economic policies that would give us the best impact? And it was a really stellar bunch of economists who did the study. Cameron Hepburn, who runs the Oxford Smith School, Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner from the United States, and Lloyd Stern, a climate economist from the UK. And they looked at 700 different recovery packages over a long period of time, and analyzed them into groups of packages and conceptual groups. And then they went out to something like 300 economists around the world. And what they said to them is, based on all of your experience and all of your own intellectual architecture, you tell us what are the types of recovery investment that will give two things: the quickest payback, and second, the deepest impact. So quickest payback and deepest impact, the most effective investments. And what was interesting is there was a deep consensus from economists around the world. These weren't progressive economists particularly. They were from central banks. They were from the treasury departments of countries around the world, as well as academics. And what emerged from all of these economists was that they felt the quickest return and the best payback was from green, deeply green investment. So it was in green energy, in clean R&D, in natural capital, so preservation of forests, improvement of soil, that kind of things, in natural capital, and in the developing world, in broadly improved agriculture practices as well. But that was it was an extremely interesting result. So, and the reason these economists did that was to then try to influence economic policymakers around the world in how they conceived of their green recovery packages for after COVID. So what are some important actors doing? How is it playing out? So as I said, let's take a quick look at the EU, at the UK and China, at ambitions that have been expressed, at some of the policies that have been or are being enacted with, in some cases, we can already see what's working, what's going and what's not working. And then how might we, as citizens, help enforce whatever requirements are put in place for the money to be spent in a green way. So when you go to the EU, the numbers are very big. And there are two numbers I want to point to. The first is a 750 billion euro recovery package, a bailout for the member states of the Union. And the second, and that's quite specific in terms of COVID economic recovery. And the second is the Green Deal. And the Green Deal is worth spending some time on. So the Green Deal was invented as a concept and as a program before COVID, but it was very fortunate that it was. It's rather like these COVID vaccines that are being invented now. The Oxford vaccine, for example, we have these vaccines relatively quickly compared to usual vaccine discovery because scientists were already working on something that was entirely relevant to the problem. And that's what the Green Deal at the EU feels like. It's entirely relevant to the problem of post-COVID recovery and making it green. And it's kind of a political miracle, the Green Deal. So the prior commission, there's an election every 5 years. There's a new commission that comes in. The prior commission really didn't have climate on its agenda at all, particularly. This current commission, which came in the spring, with its Green Deal, decided that they would make all of the spending of the EU consistent with reaching the Paris climate targets, which for the EU means net carbon neutrality by 2050 and a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. So all of the plans, all of the programs, all of the spending of the EU, then this new commission coming in, they declared would be lined up with these objectives. Now that's an enormous ambition because you have hundreds or thousands of areas of activity, certainly hundreds of pieces of legislation, all of which then have to be reconceived in a fundamental way. And this is very similar to what's happening in China when I get to China. But the idea that the EU would begin to conceive of all of its legislative and all of its spending activity in terms of how do we turn around all of the activity we're funding, from agriculture to industry to vehicle transportation and on with the Paris Agreement. So it's remarkable that that happened just before COVID came upon us. And again, the number is big there too. That's the budget for the EU over 7 years of its budget cycle is just over €1 trillion. So a big number, which if invested well, would mean a great deal for green movement in the recovery. So, so the question, as always with the EU, becomes beautifully articulated ambition, beautiful concept, beautiful theory, but how does it work out in practice? You know, and the line of an American entomologist, E.O. Wilson, comes to mind. Somebody, he's the world expert on ants, #1 world expert on ants, now very senior, famous prize-winning scientist. And because ants work communally, and all the ants in a colony will be sisters, someone asked him, Professor Wilson, what do you think of communism? They undoubtedly thought that it had something to do with ants all working as one. And Wilson's response to the question, what do you think of communism, was, beautiful theory, wrong species, meaning great theory, but it's not going to work for humans. So at the EU, often we have beautiful theories, and then the question is, how do they actually work out in practice? Have they been designed for the right species? Now, and what that comes to is often, it's a technical term in EU law, which is conditionality. So if you have the idea that you're going to condition all of your spending for, for energy on the Green Deal, how does that condition work? What is the conditionality? How do you set the terms? And then how do you enforce them at the level of the member state? And often there's a gap between the concept and the enforcement. But let's look at a few highlights of what the EU is doing, some that are going well. And the ones that I was just looking at today tend to be in the area of natural capital. That's one of those categories that the economists said was the right investment if you're going to do a quick and good green recovery. And the first is chemicals. Now, chemicals is an area that's hard to regulate because the chemical industry has interests that are directly opposed to human health, really, and the health of the biosphere. So it's been difficult to regulate. But there is a good chemical strategy that's now come out with the goal of detoxifying the entire economy. And that's an enormous goal, detoxifying the economy, and they mean it. They're committed to regulations that reduce or eliminate hormone-disrupting chemicals, one of the most dangerous kinds of chemicals in terms of human and also ecosystem health. There's a new climate law being worked on, and that's in process. And the Parliament has upped the strength of the law so that it starts with the Commission and the EU system goes to Parliament. Parliament has upped the strength of the law so that it would require the EU member states to reduce carbon emissions by 60% by 2030 and then 100% by 2050. That's higher than the 55%, which is the Commission's and the current standard. What the Parliament also inserted, and it's very important, was that there was greater access under its version of the law for citizen groups, members of the public, to challenge member states' national climate plans. So if you create an architecture in which the Commission says something, member states say something, and then there's no way that the public can come in and hold to account the governments which have made promises, then the experience is that the governments don't do more than promise. They very seldom actually meet the promises. So you need that transparency and you need that access to justice. Now that climate law is now in the Council. That's the third of the initial stages, and we'll see what they say in 2021. The hope is that it remains a strong climate law for the entire EU. And then there's a nature law, a nature protection law, which would be great. It's also in process, and the ambition of the law from the European Commission is to make legally binding restoration targets for Europe. That's important. Restoration of ecosystems has emerged as one of the most important things that we need to do in order to reduce climate change. So restoration of nature at the European level, where nature is often very damaged because of the high populations and high industrial experience of Europe, would be very important. And the ambition is to have 30% of the land and sea protected, which links up with the global ambitions of the global ecosystem of countries in the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting that will be coming up in China next year. The EU is also talking about planting 1 billion trees, which is a good number. Next, on food, they have what they call a farm to fork strategy. And the idea is to reduce pollution and the use of dangerous chemicals. And again, it's a very good strategy. This one is going well in the legislative process. And the idea will be to reduce pesticides in all EU member countries by 50% by 2030. That's a big reduction. And that's very much against the strong influence of the chemical industry. And then to reduce fertilizers by 30%, also quite good. To increase production of all farmlands, all agricultural production to 25% organic, another very ambitious target. And then reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in the EU by 55% by 2030. Another big target, because agricultural emissions are harder to reduce, have been harder to reduce than from vehicles or from smokestacks. So these are all very, very good investments in natural capital of the type that the economist pointed to. And that's from the Green Deal budget over 7 years. One that's not going so great is the Common Agricultural Policy reform. And the Common Agricultural Policy is an example of a subsidy system that really deeply needs to be aligned with COVID recovery and also the Paris Agreement. Because at the EU level, it's 60 billion euros a year. It's an enormous amount of money as an annual subsidy. And it is single-handedly what created industrial farming throughout the EU. It's what has driven farming to being industrial farming, and it needs deep reform. And there, the progress is slower. I mean, of that 60 billion, I'm sure that that we and our colleagues in the environmental groups will swing a chunk of that away to align more with the farm to fork strategy I just mentioned, but that there's going to be a lot of work there. So not all of these things are easy to bring about when you're looking at such a thorough change in how you do things. But that was the Green Deal. I mentioned there was also a 750 billion direct COVID recovery program from the EU. This is the first time the EU countries have agreed to borrowing together for this kind of project, and France and Germany were behind it. It's a good deal of money. There's a problem with it, however, and this is a very good example of the kind of problem that dogs even the best intentions as we transition into trying to do things in a much greener way in all realms of regulation and finance. And the problem with it is that, so you have the 750 bond purchase agreement from the European Central Bank. The idea is then a number of central banks in Europe actually do the bond purchases. Problem, what sort of bonds are they purchasing? So this is a huge subsidy, essentially, and whose bonds will they be purchasing? If they were green bonds, if they were buying debt from companies that were producing only renewable energy, only doing renewable agriculture, and so on, then you would have a deeply constructive recovery process going on. However, the banks are very conservative, and so far what they've said is we're going to buy bonds in the market based on the way we always do that. And the way we always do that is based on a menu, and 50% or more of that menu are fossil fuel related companies. It's just the way business has always been done. And 40 years ago, that might have been a good idea. It's no longer a good idea, but the menu hasn't yet changed. It really needs to change if this is going to be a green COVID recovery. But that's one example of what needs to be a systemic change in how central banks do their business. Now, that was EU. EU member states, when I mentioned Germany and France, were behind this large bond purchase, which was in itself a good idea. It's only when you get into the details it gets difficult. But what are they doing themselves? Well, they're not just leaving it to the level of EU finance. They're also committing their own national finance. And Germany says it's going to spend 40 billion euros of its money on climate change work next year, which would be part of a green recovery. And France has committed to 31 billion for, again, in addition to the EU money. So that is all very interesting. It's all very much in process, but it's all gives me a tremendous amount of hope that a lot of good will happen, and fairly rapid change is possible when you have the central authorities of the EU committed to rapid change and actually putting quite a lot of money behind it. Then the question becomes two things really: where exactly is the money going, and then how exactly are you conditioning the spending so that it actually reaches down and becomes on the ground meaningful and also enforceable. So with that overlook of the EU, let's turn to the UK. And I want to look at two things in terms of the UK. One is the bailouts of industry that the UK has and will do. And then at Boris Johnson's recent 10-point plan. Now, in terms of bailouts, I sent a letter to Boris Johnson in June saying that he had a fantastic opportunity in doing bailouts to push a green recovery very quickly in the UK. And what I outlined were 4 points, which would allow bailouts to become a high leverage mechanism for moving companies into green space. And so the first thing you need to do is to require the company reports on its activities in its annual reports and other reports in line with the Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related financial disclosure. So that task force on climate-related financial disclosure, which was chaired by Mark Carney and Bloomberg, came out with a very good set of guidelines on how companies should disclose. They're voluntary at present. Not many companies are doing it, not enough companies. So if you're bailing out a company, the first thing to do is simply make it a requirement that in order to get the taxpayers' money, you have to meet these financial disclosures on climate. Second is that the company must commit to achieve net zero in its so-called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, that is in all of its impacts, by 2050 or earlier. And this is in line with the Paris Agreement, of course, and what we were just talking about at the level of the EU. The UK has also committed to that 2050 net zero target. But there is no law at present demanding that companies do the same thing. So if on a company by company basis, for the companies that you were bailing out, you made that requirement, you would be moving essentially the Paris Agreement targets into the corporate space in a very useful way. And then in line with that, the third point is that they would have to write a business plan within a year of getting the bailout, which includes the goals, all quite precise goals for how to meet those Paris targets. So how they're going to get by 2050 to net zero, but how by 2030 they're going to get to, say, 55% reduction in all of their emissions. That way the company comes in line with Paris and also will be a much healthier company. I mean, what Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, said over the last few months several times was, if you're a company and you're not heavily reducing your carbon emissions by 2030 in line with Paris, then what you're going to find is you're no longer a good company. You're no longer a profitable company. You're no longer a company that that lenders will lend to. You will find yourself going out of business. So here, if you are giving taxpayers money to a company, it becomes extremely sensible to put in the requirement that they come up with a business plan that will do this, and that has measurable targets along the way. And fourth point there is that then you have to get the company to make sure that to have the executive's salary be tied to meeting that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that is, I'm still waiting to hear from Boris Johnson on that. I hope that the wisdom of that does spark his interest and they start using that in bailouts. The first bailout that they did, Celsa Steel, is the only one I've looked at so far. And there was good language in the newspapers and the financial press about what the government required. And what they said is that the bailout conditions included commitments to protect jobs, to prevent climate change, and to improve corporate governance around such issues as executive pay. And that's all good, and that's all in alignment with suggestions. But the frustrating thing was that, that the agreement was secret under the notion of corporate confidentiality, but shouldn't be. These are conditions that are attached to taxpayers' money, and if we can't see them, we don't know what they really say, and certainly we don't know if they're enforceable. The idea was that these were legally binding, but unless you see them, you can't tell if they're legally binding. And then legally binding, what does it mean in terms of enforceability? So the question there on bailouts, a great opportunity to use bailouts as a way of pushing companies quickly in a way that will ultimately benefit them as well as taxpayers. Now, then moving on to the 10-point plan. You will have seen it in the papers. It reads very well. One can hardly disagree with the basic architecture of the 10-point plan. The banning of sale of internal combustion engines by 2030, the promotion of wind and hydrogen, an increased commitment to insulate buildings. One of the things the UK has done very poorly, and we're much worse at building insulation than any other country in Europe or at least in Western Europe that I'm aware of. And then also a fairly small commitment to planting trees, hiring people in the country to plant trees. The problem, the main criticism that's been made, and I agree with it, is that even though it is a nice looking plan, that isn't funded well isn't going to do much. And Downing Street says it's committing 12 billion to this, but after analyzing the proposal, the Labour Party analysts said that only 4 billion of that money is actually new money. So if you have a green recovery plan for 4 billion, that's not much of a plan, even 12 billion, really. An industry group said it needed to be at a minimum 33 billion, so around 3 times as much to be meaningful, and that sounds about right. If you want a sense of comparison, the government is spending 100 billion pounds on the HS2 rail line. That's a great deal more than the 12 or 4, depending on who you believe, about how much new money is being committed. And once again, in terms of benchmarks, in addition to all the EU money that they're involved with and backing, France and Germany, in addition, are from their own budgets, putting in 40 and 30 billion next year, respectively. So it gives you a sense of scale, and it is good in itself, but not big enough, I think. Any serious analyst would agree. Now, I want to turn to China, because we don't hear many positive things about China in the West. I work in China. I mean, Client Earth is an organization now with 110 lawyers, 215 people, and we have offices across Europe, also in Beijing. And we've been there since 2014, working quite closely with the government in order to help speed up their attempts to clean up pollution of all types, including the greenhouse gas pollution. And that has brought us into working quite deeply with the Supreme People's Court, the Supreme Court of China. We've trained over 1,000 judges on how to decide environmental cases. We work with the national prosecutors, and we've trained over 500 of them. And remarkably, since that training started with the prosecutors in 2016, the prosecutors have brought more than 100,000 environmental cases. So this gives you a sense of the scale and the rapidity with which the Chinese are keen to change environmental behavior in their country. When you talk to senior officials, they completely understand that it is in the enlightened self-interest of China to clean up its own pollution and to reduce its carbon impacts. That's extremely encouraging. And when you're there working with these people and seeing how quickly they want to do things and are doing things, the scale and pace of it is much, much larger than what's going on in the West. And now they have more to do. They have an area that they need to catch up, but the will is there and the action is also there. Now, in terms of green recovery and alignment of governmental obligations and finance, with these notions. President Xi in September made a surprise speech in the United Nations. Now, we knew he was making a speech. We didn't know all the content of it. And in addition to making an argument that all countries needed to cooperate in having a green COVID recovery, which was a good thing to hear, he went beyond that and said that he was committing China to carbon neutrality of all of its emissions before 2060. I remember the EU and the UK are doing it by 2050. And she said before 2060. Now that's important because China is the world's biggest carbon emitter at present. And it's important because the Chinese, I know from working with them, tend to under promise and over perform. So that when he says before 2060, it's based on a tremendous amount of analysis. And they know they can do it before 2060 and they're committing to do it. Now, shortly after that, Japan, the next week or so, followed by saying that they were now going to adopt the 2050 carbon neutrality target. South Korea did the same thing. Philippines banned the construction of all new coal-fired power stations. All of that, again, very encouraging. Now, there are countervailing forces as well in China. The economic recovery has led to the possibility of a bunch of new coal-fired power stations. That's a problem. There are already 1,000 operating ones roughly in China, and current plans are for another 230 coal-fired power stations to be built in China as part of an economic recovery. That wouldn't be a green COVID recovery. Now, however, again, the president has announced that he is all for a green recovery, and plans are shifting. And we'll find out exactly what's happening in the spring. Their 14th five-year plan will be published. And the expectation of many China analysts, including me, is that we'll see a great diminution in coal, in the use of coal in this 14th five-year plan that will give us hope that and evidence that they're actually on that path quite quickly to carbon neutrality and to a large carbon reduction by 2030. Now that's inside China. What about ex-China? So China has a big global footprint as well, and they have a project called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is to link around 100 countries with China in a deeper economic way. And that involves building infrastructure, and it's the largest infrastructure building project in human history. It's bigger than the Marshall Fund projects in Europe after World War II. It's enormous. Consider 100 countries and trillions of dollars of investment. Now, how that is spent will depend, it depends on how it's spent and whether we reach the Paris Agreement or not. Because if all of that investment in infrastructure goes the wrong way, brown energy, ports placed in the wrong places, roads, railroads put in the wrong places, destroying biodiversity, and we won't meet Paris Agreement targets. But if done in the right way, and this becomes an enormous COVID recovery green investment project, much as the green plans of the EU are able to step in quite quickly and make a very deep and powerful and long-term COVID recovery. The Belt and Road Initiative can do the same. However, it wasn't designed to do that. It was designed some time ago as a series of uncoordinated investments with no central authority looking at them from the point of view of whether they were going to be green or brown. We and others have been arguing for some years now that that needs to change, and that there needs to be a central authority, and there needs to be a that looks at the environmental credentials of all proposed projects, whether they're power plants or roads or railroads or ports, and rates them as to whether they're environmentally acceptable or not. And I'm very pleased to say, and this is another big piece of news that in the West is very little known, that the Ministry of Environment in China has taken this on as its project. I'm one of hundreds of Western advisors that are advising them on how to design this. There's a draft that's finished, and it's a very, very simple idea that has come out in the end called the traffic light system. And the idea would be based on relevant criteria. A project would come up for funding, and you would you would then get a green light, a yellow light, or a red light, depending on whether you were whether you should be funded from climate and biodiversity considerations. So imagine you wanted to build, you were a Chinese company who wanted to build a coal plant in Indonesia, red light. If you wanted to build a solar plant in Kenya, green light. And that's the way it should work. And that would then funnel investment very quickly towards green infrastructure and turn the Belt and Road Initiative into an investment in meeting the Paris Agreement and in improving the economies of these 100 countries that connect with China. Now, a couple of final comments before we go to questions, because I really do want to hear your questions. Is on enforcing these ideas, these obligations, when they turn into obligations. It's difficult at the EU level. It's hard for citizens to get into EU courts to challenge the EU. That's something we've been fighting for, since we opened our doors. And we're making progress, but that's not yet easy. In member states of the EU, it's much easier. So if there's an EU or national obligation, you have a much greater chance of being able to enforce it. So when it comes to recovery and green recovery and national money, one of the things you want to look at is the subsidies that get paid at national levels, and then making sure they're green. So we've been attacking subsidies on coal, for example, successfully. Another type of subsidy is in the energy system through what is called a capacity market, where countries are allowed to invest in the energy system in order to keep the lights on. And that can be done either like the Belt and Road in a green way or a brown way. You can invest in green energy infrastructure so that you have a capacity market which moves the country's energy system in a green way, or you can try, as Britain did, and as Spain did, and as Poland did, to invest in coal. Now, it is possible to challenge those, and that's an interesting area to work in, challenging capacity markets that try to move the energy subsidies towards fossil fuels instead of away from fossil fuels. Now, in the UK, what the government is doing, of course, we're going through Brexit. A lot of it involves new legislation, the Environment Bill, the Agriculture Bill. How much good stuff appears in there, we have yet to see in final terms, although there are some concerning things that have shown up so far. But then whether they're enforceable and what degree you can hold the government to account, we'll have to see. We and all of the other civil society groups are arguing for transparency and access to justice for citizens to make sure the government meets the obligations it takes upon itself. The UK government is at the same time, though, trying to reduce citizen access to courts, access to judicial review. And if they succeed in that, that will also be worrying. Now, other good things that are going on there in the UK worth mentioning. There's a pensions bill in Parliament, which I think will go through and would require all pension funds to, on a mandatory basis, meet those climate disclosure norms that I was talking about earlier from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So that bill would make the entire pensions industry in the UK have to, on a mandatory basis, do that disclosure, which would send enormous amounts of information about the climate change behavior of the companies they invested in to the markets, so that investors could be able to see much more readily and move investment from green companies or companies that are acting in a green way, which will be more likely to succeed, and away from companies that are not. And finally, China. So I talked about all the good things happening in China. Two more good things. One is that in the relationship between China and the EU is a great sweet spot. It's one of the political sweet spots in the world at the moment. Both the EU and China are deeply committed to doing something about climate change. They are both deeply aware of the consequences of not doing it. They have both deeply analyzed what their own industrial and legal systems and financial systems can do about it. And the good news is that they want to talk to each other. And we are the secretariat at Client Earth for the EU-China Environment Program. So that connects the EU with China on environment. And we've been facilitating dialogues between senior officials in the EU and China. Imagine a world in which the EU and China cooperated beautifully on climate, and in which President Biden comes in and forms a three-way partnership. He has big climate ambitions himself. So I brought it from the level of the economics to the level of what different countries or groups of countries see as COVID-related financial impacts they can have, and the steps they're taking. Some of the successes already, some of the difficulties we face, and then this hope that that China, the EU, and now possibly the US come into a global alliance, realizing that it's in all of their mutual self-interest to act together. And if that happens, I don't doubt that we can have a very rapid change in how society comes out of COVID, but into a much deeper and greener future. So let me leave my remarks there, and then please, I'd love to have your questions.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, James. You covered off, you covered off a lot there. So thank you very much. Yeah, we have about 15 minutes left, so I'll go straight to questions. We've had a few come in already. Thank you to those people who've submitted questions. Do keep them coming in. I'll kick off with a couple of questions, UK based. So Neil has said he agrees with you about the limited scale of the UK government's Green Plan. What sense do you have about where the blockages are in the UK government to a plan of the scale required, where pressure and where can pressure be most effectively applied? And then beyond the government, what James has asked, what corporates can do? How can corporates get involved in the green recovery beyond annual reporting?
So, well, I think on the first plan, I mean, my sense in working in the UK is always that when a good and necessary environmental thing doesn't happen, it's generally blocked by the Treasury. So if you have any friends who can talk to Rishi Sunak, tell them to get on the phone and say that the Oxford and global economists say this is actually the best investment he can be making, and he's skinting on the actual best investment. So I think it's the Treasury. I know when we sued the UK government over air pollution, and the UK Supreme Court said that the country needed to come into compliance as soon as possible. What we found is that what was blocking it was the Treasury's unwillingness to invest, even though 40,000 people a year were dying, and even though the law said that that economics is no excuse. So that's generally the barrier. So what can corporates do? I mean, there's an enormous amount that corporates can do. I mean, really the most powerful thing is what I was suggesting Boris forces companies that the nation bails out to do, is to look at your corporate business plan and see what you need to do to write a Paris-aligned business plan. So for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, so your own emissions, your all of your suppliers, and ultimately your customers in scope 3. So all of the activities of the company. How do you reduce all impacts to net zero by 2050? And set yourself a good target and say by 55 or 60% by 2030. How would you do that? And a number of companies are doing that now. I think that the companies that are doing that and will do that are the ones that they'll succeed, because they're forcing themselves to think into a new world, and they're going to be ahead of everybody else.
Great, thank you. We're going to focus quickly on the EU. So Paul Dinsdale, he's talking about the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, I know in your talk just now, you did say it needs big reform. Paul has asked, how do they do that when the Commission always resists reform? Is there a strategy? And Ken Barker has asked as well, so Hungary and Poland blocked the EU package last week or the week before.
Yep.
What can be done about that? Is there a path out of that stalemate?
Well, as to the second question first, there will be a path out of the stalemate. I mean, the question is whether it's simply a negotiating tactic on the part of Poland and Hungary, and I suspect it is. But let's spend a second on that. It's uncomfortable because what the EU said is that you're going to that everyone will participate in this, and if all countries actually comply with the rule of law. With the rule of law as understood by quite explicit EU terms. For example, an independent judiciary. That's one big thing. Poland and Hungary, both of whom have been attacking their judiciary and to make it certainly not independent, said that they simply wouldn't agree that they should comply with the rule of law. They wanted the money from the EU, but they wanted to not comply with the rule of law. I mean, that's just outrageous. It's as outrageous as you can possibly be. So what happens if we go to the wall? Well, we all know what happens with Brexit if we go to the wall. What happens with this if we go to the wall? Well, if there's no budget agreement by the beginning of the year, then an austerity budget kicks in. There will be an EU budget, but it's an austerity budget. What that means is that there won't be any bailout money for Hungary and Poland. Now, get that. This is their worst economic time since, probably the Second World War. They really need the bailout. So something will happen in the meantime. Angela Merkel has been quite quiet in these negotiations, as she often is. She was, as I mentioned, important and facilitated the beginning of it. But she needs to take aside the leaders of Hungary and Poland, and I think something will happen. Now, on the cap, what's interesting here is that the Commission is actually quite well intentioned. So the Commission has wanted the current Commission, the former Commission, remember I said that they all went out of office, a new one came in. The former Commission had a cap that was ready to go, ready to be taken into the Parliament before it went out of office. And that was just the traditional cap. It was industrial agriculture. The new one came into power and said that it wanted to do a cap that was actually consistent with the Green Deal. And so it had this idea of creating soil that was actually alive, reducing the use of pesticides and toxic substances. And we've been working very closely in the Parliament and with the Commission and all the other NGOs working on this. And it's still in process. So the current cap is going to be extended by 2 years. So there's a further 2 years to negotiate changes here. And I think momentum is swinging towards doing something much greener because people are really beginning to understand. Now, what's on the other side? The enormous agrochemical industry is on the other side. They don't want to reduce pesticides. They don't want to reduce chemicals. They don't want to have independent advisors tell farmers what to do. They want, as is currently the case, the advisors that go around to member states to tell farmers how to farm are connected with the chemical companies, and they don't want to see that change. But I think if we get another 2 years to work on this, it'll change significantly.
Great, thank you. Valerie has asked, is there a strategy for persuading central banks to do things differently? So changing the menu or what levers can be brought to bear?
Well, yes, it's a great question. And so the European, Christine Lagarde, the woman who runs the European Central Bank, is saying that she wants to do things in the right way. Now, there's a lot of politics behind the scenes that I don't know. But yes, so she from the top at the European Central Bank wants to do things in the right way. And we're talking to banks. So, I mean, one question is whether it's possible to articulate legal obligations that they must follow. And I think it is, and that will make the discussions go better. So central banks are organs of countries. So they're part of the governmental infrastructure of a country. Those countries have all signed on to the Paris Agreement, which requires the reduction in emissions. And I think it's possible to make a coherent argument that then all of the key entities of that government need to act consistently to reduce emissions according to the Paris compliance plan. And that includes central banks. And you don't do that by propping up fossil fuel companies. So that's the argument. And we're beginning to make it to central banks. The European Central Bank understands it. And there's hope there. There may even be litigation. That would be very interesting litigation.
Absolutely. Jim has asked, does having a Green Deal make you more or less competitive? And how has the Green Deal affected Brexit discussions?
Oh, I think ultimately it makes you tremendously more, much more competitive. So an example there would be the Chinese were way ahead of the Europeans on. So the Europeans traditionally have seen themselves, and not incorrectly, as leaders in automotive technology, BMW, Mercedes, Porsche, and so on. But they were actually falling way behind the Chinese in terms of technology, and they were very committed to continuing to sell diesel engines. Diesel engines were producing air pollution; it was killing people, and we sued them and won. And we got judges to ban the use of diesel cars in Düsseldorf, Stuttgart, and Munich. That made people walk away from buying diesel. Sales went down 25% very quickly. And it helped push the German car companies towards their current interest in electric technology. So you see the German manufacturers moving far faster into electric vehicles than they were doing. That's an example of a regulatory requirement, here clean air, enforced by us, citizens, against the car companies, moving them much more rapidly to a new technological space, which will make them globally competitive. They were about to have their pants knocked off by the Chinese, and now they've got a chance again.
Great, thank you. And just sticking with China quickly, we have a question from Christopher Whitaker, who says, in the long term, can an autocratic political system like China, which is self-serving, ever be capable of working collaboratively with the rest of the world? Or does this not matter if their program is entirely internalized and they solve their own problems?
It's a good question, but let me start with the end of the question. So solving their own problems internally isn't going to be enough, and they know that. I mean, they have a wonderful concept called ecological civilization. And the idea is they are deeply reforming their economy in all of its aspects so that they achieve an ecological civilization. And that's out of enlightened self-interest. I really trust people when they act out of enlightened self-interest because they get it and then they do it. And that's what the Chinese are doing. Now, the reason I was talking about the Belt and Road Initiative is you can do all that inside the country, and it's not enough because there are enormous external consequences, a big external footprint as well. And that's why why I'm encouraged by what I see about Belt and Road. But can an autocratic system work effectively with a democratic system? I think yes, when there's a mutual interest. So if the people living in both systems are people, and if the people are smart enough to wake up to there being a mutual interest, then there's no reason in the world they can't work together. And that's what I'm beginning to see in this thing I was describing as the political sweet spot between China and Europe. They're really discussing how do we collaborate on climate change. I'll give you another example. It was Barack Obama back in the time of sane presidents. Well, we've got another one now, but back in the time of sane presidents who reached a personal agreement with Xi Jinping. They sat down and they said, we're going to work on climate together. And then the day Trump got into office, the governor of California, a remarkable guy called Jerry Brown, got on a plane and went to Beijing, and he signed a treaty between California and China on climate. Quite remarkable. So yes, I think is the answer. It's very encouraging that when people see a mutual interest and they each see it also as their self-interest, then I think you can get beautiful collaboration across systems. Then the ideology doesn't matter so much. What you're looking for is a pragmatic solution to a mutually perceived, mutually identified problem. And if you then reach a joint solution, why not implement it?
Absolutely, that's great. We're nearly out of time, so I'm just going to finish up with a couple of questions specifically about Client Earth. So somebody's asked, what has been Client Earth's biggest success so far? And James Sheward has asked, what plans does Client Earth have to take forward its aims and ambitions?
Yes, well, biggest success, in a sense, is growing as quickly as we have, because we work on all the big issues. And it started out as one person, in 2007. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, we're 220 people now and 110 lawyers from 26 countries, and offices, London, Brussels, Berlin, Warsaw, Beijing, soon to be Singapore and Los Angeles. And we work on all the big issues, so climate change, nature protection, protection of fisheries, human health. In terms of legal victories, the largest scale ones that we're known for are the air pollution cases we've now brought in 20 countries across the EU, about 80 cases, and all successful with local organizations. And then we stopped a new generation of coal-fired power stations in the EU. And there was a whole new generation that was about to be built, and you can't build them anymore. We'll stop you, and everyone knows that. So we want to take that particular skill to Asia now. So there are about, I mentioned 1,000 in China, but there are about 1,600 coal-fired power stations in Europe, in Asia, and another 400 and some planned. And what we want to do is work with groups all over Asia to prevent those new ones from being built, and then to begin to shut down all of the existing ones. And we do that sometimes by stopping a particular power plant from being built, but sometimes it's by redesigning the law of the energy market. So if you redesign the energy market, you redesign the flow of capital so that money goes away from fossil fuel towards something clean. And the ambition there isn't just to stop what's bad. The ambition is, in this case, to deliver clean electricity to 350 million people in Asia who don't have it. They just don't have it. So they need a good life. They need an improved life. And we want to help deliver clean energy to them while simultaneously reducing climate change. And that's possible.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James. We are out of time. I want to carry on talking, but we can't, unfortunately. We do have other questions that we haven't got round to, so sorry that we haven't managed to get through them all. But a big thank you to James for joining us today. It's been so insightful. And thank you to everyone who joined us, whether on Zoom here or YouTube or other social media channels. One final thank you to our sponsors, Charities Aid Foundation, Adnams and the RIBA. If anyone would like to hear about what we have going on next year, particularly our COP26 activities, then do please get in touch with me or one of my colleagues at the crowd. And once again, a big thank you, James, and thank you for everyone joining us today. Thank you.